My name is Bente Pedersen. I'm 50 plus, and I'm a writer of historical romances. And in my former life, I was a teacher. I'm from Skibotn, which has been the gateway to Norway for a lot of Finnish people. And I'm grown up in a family of 3 cultures: the Sea-Sami, the Finnish, and the Norwegian. And when I grew up in the 1960s, of course, everything was Norwegian. But becoming a teenager, I realized that, of course, we were Finnish as well. Because the secret languages in my home and in my village was the Finnish. When children weren't supposed to hear or understand, the languages snapped from Norwegian to Finnish. It was always this: small kettles have also ears. And then the interesting stories began, and we didn't understand anything. So my mother spoke Finnish. My grandmother spoke Finnish and Sami because her mother was Sami, her father was Finnish. We've grown up in this boiling culture, and it was layer on layer. And on top you had the Norwegian, the status pyramid, Norwegian, then you had the Finnish, then you had the reindeer Sami, and then you had the Sea-Sami, which we came from, and that was the lowest of the lowest. It has changed over the years, of course. Now people are digging in the cultures, but it is still very hard for my mother's generation and my grandmother's generation to say that they have the Sea-Sami. So my grandmother died in 1996, and the last year she was very ill. She had cancer, and we talked a lot about family and what we came from. And she often said, "I wish I knew more about my mother's story. Where did my mother come from?" And the big internet was open, so I checked where her mother came from. She was born in a village just across the fjord. We should have known her history, but we didn't, because she came from that shameful Sea-Sami origin. And we knew everything about my grandmother's father's family, the family that came from the Torne Valley. We had lots and lots and lots of stories about the Finnish. And it helped a lot that my great-grandfather's mother came from the Grape family. And if you dug very, very far there, you found even the shields you could hang on the wall from the gentry in Germany. So that was the nicest story, those stories we told. But the Sea-Sami stories, no. They were the people who struggled, right? And up till the First World War ended, the Sea-Samis and the Norwegian were really at the same status in the village. Because then they all did the same work. They fished, they farmed, and they had the same lousy houses. And they bought the floor from the Russian people who came sailing in the fjords, swapping fish for floor for fish. In 1917, that stopped with the Russian Revolution. And no more floor from the Russians. You had to buy from the Norwegian shopkeeper. And then the Norwegian farmer suddenly had a lot of praise because he understood the language. He was on the same level almost as the shopkeeper, while the Sea-Sami spoke Sami. And he had less possibilities to interact with the shopkeeper. And from 1918 on, the Sea-Sami became the poor people in the small villages because they didn't have the same possibilities as the Norwegian farmers. And from then on, that was the big shame. The Sea-Sami was seen as dirty, poor, less than the Norwegian. And of course, people aren't stupid. Then they say, we are not Sea-Samis. We try to learn Norwegian. We try we try to adapt the Norwegian culture. And the Sea-Sami died more or less. And in my mother's generation, they still say that, okay, maybe they spoke Sami, but they didn't have the costume. They weren't really Sami. I don't know the languages. They died. It took 3 generations to take away the languages. And when you lose the language, you lose a part of the culture as well. So they meant for the best, of course, when they didn't teach. They wanted us to have all the possibilities in the Norwegian society. But it would have been nice to know both Sami and Finnish. Language is, after all, the largest culture carrier in the world. And through language you express yourself, you tell your stories, you bring your stories on, the knowledge from generations. And we lose, of course, both the fairy tales, the songs, the music, everything. We become Norwegian. And in my region, in the time between the wars, there was given Norwegian weeklies to Finnish families in Lyngen, in Finnmark, in all the areas where there were a lot of Finnish people, because they were supposed to learn the culture from Norway in a nice way. And of course people like everything you get for free. So of course they read, and it was very common even in the 1960s when I grew up that everybody had weeklies, and you could wonder why. You could wonder, had everybody bad taste? And when I found out that the state actually gave money for this project, and the priests and the military picked out the people in cultural need who should get these weeklies. And I used to say that it's not really a crack in my cultural upbringing that I write romances. It's a part of my cultural heritage, really. And they also had boxes of books of Norwegian literature in these places permanently. In Skibotn we had 100 really good Norwegian books bringing the Norwegian culture up to the 1960s, when the real common libraries came. So they did their best to make us Norwegian, and we became Norwegian. People knew that if you kept your mouth shut, you got the jobs that the state gave, and that was important in a small village like Skibotn. And the generations before mine, they knew that if you had Finnish names, you didn't get land close to the border. It's quite accepting, and they took the Norwegian names and allowed the Finnish names to disappear. Only a few families still have the Finnish names. There were stories I found out in the 1980s when I studied to be a teacher. I came over a tiny little sentence that said that people in the Torne Valley sold their children to Samis who took them over to Norway. And that was, that doesn't ring right. But at the same time, I remembered my grandmother used to tell me that her father's foster mother came to Malangen with the Samis when she was 5. And I had never really questioned the story. But then I asked her, did Eva come over alone? And Granny says, well, yes, I thought you understood that. I didn't. And then you start digging and try to figure out what really happened. And of course there were ages with poverty, and parents in desperation sometimes had to send their children to Norway, where they maybe could get a home. And the migrating Samis traveling back and forth to the Sameland by the sea in Norway could take these children with them. And this was mainly in the beginning of the 1800s, but also around 1860 with the really harsh years in northern Finland. And we find these kids when they are up for confirmation. They have no parents. They maybe remember where they are from, and you maybe find a few words in the church books where it says they are sold for 5 riksdaler, 10 riksdaler, 2 barrels of flour, maybe a cow. We don't know. That's one of the sad stories that people really haven't dived into. I know there was a lot of writing in Swedish papers around 1838, 1840. We have Lars Levi Lestadius, who said that the parents had themselves sent the children with the Samis or with relatives. And he thought it was okay that the Samis got some compensation for the travel when they came to Norway. But a lot of people were against it, and because of all the writing, this was, the practice really died around the 1840s, before again a few years in the 1860s. So my great-grandfather's foster mother came in 1858, and I found her story. She was born in the Karesuando region. Her mother died when she was 5, and her father wasn't able to keep the children together. So all the children were spread, and Eva came to Norway. And we also know that the poor people, the poor children, were sort of, both in Norway, in Sweden, in Finland, they were sort of set up for auctions, where you placed them with families. And the families got a little money for taking care of them. So those who said they could take them for the least got them. So it was some sort of children's sale before we got the welfare institutions in Scandinavia. And I know, I don't know, I've heard of this even in 1910 in my region. There was a lady who had been sold like this when she was 2 years old. But I read the laws, and the law sort of said this is not going to happen anymore in Norway in 1896. But from they say we are not going to do it till they actually don't do it, can take time. It can take as much as 10 years. But that is another of the stories we don't tell. We know of families where they have inherited the farm they came to, because they obviously came to people who had no children. But we also see that a lot of them became servants and probably didn't have a good life. And you have to dig in the church books. You have to try to follow them if you find them in the church book, and see what happened with them. And there has been no real big research about this, but there has to be quite some of these children, because when I started writing about a girl who came over from Finland. And from the moment the books came out, I had phone calls from people who told me my great-grandmother, my great-grandfather had that fate. So there must have been at least some hundreds, and that's a lot when you think of how few people lived in these areas. And we know in the 1860s they don't only come over with the Samis, they come over with relatives and other people who also were Finnish or Swedish, but their parents had sent 1 or 2 children with someone they knew. But then again, we don't talk about the sad stories. We don't want to know that there's something painful. So it isn't spoken a lot. And even in Norway, it's rather uncommon knowledge that people 100 years ago were put up for auction because no one could take care of them. When I tell those stories, people look at me and they don't want to know. It is painful, of course it's painful, but it's part of our stories. I haven't really found much, because you have to imagine, after all. And I know our Eva, she was a tiny little lady who became a very very dedicated Lestadian, and they took, they didn't get any children on their own, so they took to their family kids who didn't have parents. So my great-grandfather was, he lost his parents in 1882. They came from the Muonio area. Josefine was 18 and Kalle was 31 when they started walking. He was a farmer's son, she was a priest's daughter, and there is some indication that her family didn't like her choice in husband. She was pregnant when they started walking. The oldest was born in Pajala, christened by Lestadius. They came here in 1860. They got their little home, 11 children. 3 didn't live up. And in 82, when she was 40-something and he was 50-something, they both died within 3 weeks in influenza. And Marie, who was 22, married one day in June. 2 days later, she buried her parents, because when you die in winter, you can't be buried. In those days, you had to wait till summer. And 2 days after the funeral, she had her youngest brother, Fredrik, christened, and she took him to Kvænangen, north of here, where he grew up with her family. But the other children were spread. Another bunch of children spread all over. And my great-grandfather Jakob lived with Biribekkan Eva and her Johan. And he inherited the farm. But there were a lot of those stories. When you start looking into these villages, you find a lot of these stories. Broken up families, families that stick together, they help each other, they struggle. There is no riches, just the grey little cottages, the fish, the harsh life on the farm, small farms. Yes, in Norway we are big on long serials from history. The first one that started was a guy called Kjell Halbing, who wrote about a Texas Ranger and became a big hit. And then they decided that, okay, when men read, women read even more. We must have someone who writes for women. So they headhunted Margit Sandemo, who is big in Sweden and Norway and Denmark and Poland and has sold 30 million books. And she showed that it was possible to write for women about history, but Margit wrote sort of a mix of a lot of worlds, and they wanted someone more earthbound. And I had written for a magazine since I was 16. I financed my studies writing about true love. When I got across this story about the children from the Torne Valley, I was 22 and thought, of course I can write this story. And I rang to the editor and I asked, do you think this is a good idea? And he was stupid enough to say yes. And when I was 23, I sent the first take of that book, and it went back and forth and back and forth and back and forth a lot of times. And finally he said, okay, let's make a go at it. But they didn't know really if North Norwegian history would catch. And they didn't know if there had been enough North Norwegian history to write a series about, which triggered me. And I said, okay, I'll write from the 1700s till maybe 1900s. It will be 12 books. And I wrote the story about Raja. It covered the time 18 to 1752. That became 40 books. It took 10 years of my life. But it made it possible for me to write. And I have written 7 serials since then. I have just released my book number 200. And I'm published in all Nordic countries. Didn't go so well in Finland with the Raja story. They said nobody in Finland likes to read about when Finland was poor. and in Poland. So I've sold about 8-9 mil books. And I'm about to launch a new series next week. So it's a lot of hoo now. It's from Tromsø in the 1920s. I found that the time between the wars is very intriguing. It's the time when women, if you come from richer families, you actually can study. You can become a doctor. I saw a picture of a pretty woman on the tail of a Norwegian plane. And they told me she was the second female air pilot in Norway. And she was born in Narvik. I had never heard about her story. She was born around 1908. So I thought, okay, let's write about the girl who is born in that time, who actually learns to drive a car. She learns to fly. She can go as far as I want her to go. So I write about women who actually acts out. They are not objects. They are the subject in their own lives. And I think even people who like to read about love can have strong heroines. There are very strong women. Yeah. So my first Raja stories, there was a professor in Bergen who said that my stories weren't really historical correct because in those books, during sex she was on top. No women had been on top before 1950, he said. I don't know if you've known girls in...
How can he know?
I don't really know. He can't know women in the Arctic North.